Would you prefer me to not share my screen yet, or is that all
Yeah,
right?
let's introduce you first.
Okay.
All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you for your patience. We're all ready to start our Tubman Talks today with Dr. Timothy Walker. And thank you for noting the change in time today. We're just to accommodate everyone. This week, we're starting a slight bit earlier. So we hope that's all right with everyone. Thank you for being here. I'll pass it on to Salewa so we can introduce our speaker and do our land acknowledgement.
Okay. Second. One second. Give me 1 second, please. All right. Okay. So I'm going to start with the land acknowledgement. Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for. I apologize. I'm really sorry. There's a part of my life that's clashing right now. And if everyone can give me 1 minute. My kid is in the bathroom. I am really sorry. I'm really, really sorry. So please,
I have a 4-year-old and I'm completely.
I have 4-year-old twins.
Yeah, go ahead. It's fine.
And just as I started talking, I heard mommy up, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm so sorry.
I totally
Please,
get
1
it.
minute.
It's not a problem. It's
Thank
okay.
you.
Yeah.
No worries. So I wait, we can just chat. How is everyone today? How's everyone's week going? Oh, sorry, Dr. Walker, you're muted.
Doing very well. I just did a chat call out to my colleague, Jose Curto, who is in the audience, and I'm happy to see him there. We don't get to see each other enough, but when we cross paths, it's always interesting to share our work. So. And
That's
thanks
great.
to everyone who's in the audience and decided to come see me today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, I apologize. So we're going to start today with the land acknowledgement, and then I'd introduce our speaker today. And how it will work is that he's going to give his talk. Please, if you have questions, take notes. And when you take notes after his talk, we're going to give about 30 minutes for question and answers. Thank you very much. So thank you all for coming. Thank you again for coming today. York, we are virtually. So if it wasn't happening virtually, we'd be on the physical space of York. So we're virtually meeting at York University, and York University recognizes many indigenous nations have long-lasting relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. The area known as Tikaronto has been caretaken of by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So thank you all. Welcome today. And today we have a talk by Dr. Timothy Walker. His talk today is on Sailing to Freedom, his new book, Sailing to Freedom, Maritime Dimensions of the Underground Railroad. Excuse me. Dr. Timothy Walker is a professor at the University of Massachusetts, and he would be talking today about his new book. So please welcome everybody. Welcome, Professor Walker.
Thank you so much. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity to talk about the book. And, you know, it came out now just a little bit over a year ago, and we've had such great response to the scholarship that is presented in the book. I am one of 9 authors that collaborated to put this book together. So it's an edited volume. I wrote the introduction and the first chapter. But what I'd like to do today is to talk us through the argument of the book, tell you a little bit about how it came together as a project of historical writing. And I will lay out the main pillars of the argument that discusses how this dimension of very important Underground Railroad activity has been left largely out of the scholarship of the Underground Railroad for about the past century or so. So what I'll do now is I'll share my screen, and oh, I wanted to also mention before I do that one of the things that has developed in the year since the book came out was that we've had a conference about the subject matter of the book, in which we brought together for the first time the authors who contributed to the volume and had other scholars commentate on their work. And we've also had an exhibition that has been mounted at the New Bedford Whaling Museum about the information in the book. And that is still open. It closes on the 20th of November. It's been up for 6 months. And we hope it will be a traveling exhibition that will find other outlets and opportunities for people to see it. So that's coming in the future, so we hope. All right, so I'm going to share my screen and dive into this subject. Can you all see that, the cover of the book? Everybody's got it? Great. Okay, so Sailing to Freedom, Maritime Dimensions of the Underground Railroad. This is published by the University of Massachusetts Press in Amherst last year, and I happen to be at the Dartmouth campus of the University of Massachusetts, so they're quite autonomous and separate, just to make sure. So this is a map from the National Geographic in the United States, and it is a good sort of overview of how the Underground Railroad is often conceptualized and how it's taught, especially in public schools in the United States. And almost every American school child has, that is to say, school children in the US have some material that they are taught in their history courses at the middle school level and at the high school level, and even at the elementary level about the Underground Railroad. Well, there are some really big problems with how this map is presented. And sort of incorporated in the map is the idea that people are escaping by foot from very, very far in the deep South. You know, if we look at this map, we are to be told that from central Alabama and Mississippi and southern Louisiana and even Georgia and the Carolinas and southern Virginia, people are moving overland towards free states where slavery was illegal, represented here in blue. And the problem with that is that the historical evidence simply doesn't back up the idea that people were escaping very long distances overland using wagons or maybe a stolen horse, but mostly they're depicted as having escaped by foot or conceived of as having escaped by foot. The problem with that is that the logistics were just too overwhelmingly difficult to make that a real viable reality. The overwhelming majority of documented successful escapes over land from a southern state where slavery was legal to a northern state, they all began, those journeys began within a day or two of walking from a northern state. And so those escapes are happening from eastern Missouri, northern Kentucky, what is today West Virginia, Maryland, and this area around the Chesapeake. Almost all overland escapes began very, very close to a border with the Free State. Another thing that isn't often taught in American schools are southward escape routes going from, say, Texas along the Gulf of Mexico down to Mexico, or from Florida down into the Caribbean and the Gulf Coast ports. Our book did not cover that. Our book covered only the eastern seaboard from roughly northern Georgia to the coast of Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Maine. So there is opportunity for additional work, and we hope that future projects will spin off of the book that we created to look at other geographic regions of the US. If you wanted to escape a long distance, and this is one of the very few ways that it actually could have happened and did happen, you could escape from along the coastal south, the eastern seaboard, and escape from some of the coastal ports and waterways and the general coastline of the Deep South by water. You could do this by boat, mostly sailboat, moving along the Gulf Stream, and relatively rapidly, with relatively little effort, you could be from the very, very far south to a northern free port in a matter of days. And so that became kind of the focus of our book, looking at how this happened and what methods were used in order for people to free themselves and transfer themselves from the south to the north. What's interesting about this is that as the Underground Railroad was conceptualized and understood, even in the late 19th century, one of the very first academic books about this is a book by William Siebert, The Underground Railroad from Slavery to Freedom, and it's published in 1898. And in that book, we have an often reproduced map of overland Underground Railroad routes, almost all of them in the north. And there are some problems with Siebert's scholarship. He interviewed or corresponded with Underground Railroad operatives in the north, most of whom were white abolitionists. He didn't give a lot of attention to people of color who were also extraordinarily important to the workings of the Underground Railroad. But the point here really is that even in 1898, it was understood that most of the Underground Railroad work that was documentable was in the north, but it does recognize that there are escape routes along the coast, coastwise waterways, coming from the far south, coming out of Portsmouth, Virginia, or Norfolk, and going to the northern ports in Connecticut, Boston, New York, Philadelphia. So that was understood, but it sort of drops out of the historiography for the most part in the 20th century. Now, the way this project came together and this book came together was that when I came to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where I live, New Bedford, of course, is very well known as a whaling port, as a place where Herman Melville bases his novel Moby Dick, and it was the heart of the whaling trade. But what was relatively less known is that New Bedford was a real refuge and a destination point on the Underground Railroad. New Bedford had the highest population of people of African descent per capita of any city in the north. It was almost 9%, which is bigger than Boston or Philadelphia or New York. It didn't have as many people because it was a much smaller town, but as a representation of the percentage of the population, it was the highest in the north. And so we wanted to try to understand why that was, that people were, the story about people escaping to New Bedford. And a wonderful colleague of mine named Lee Blake, who is the president of the New Bedford Historical Society, which is a society that focuses specifically on the stories of people of color, not only people of African descent, but also Wampanoag Indians and Cape Verdeans and various other populations of color that live in this region. She approached me in about 2009 and said, look, there's this story to be told. You're relatively new in town. You're a maritime historian. Let's collaborate on telling this story of why New Bedford was such an important place in the Underground Railroad. So I said, of course, I'd love to do this. And what we did, we managed to get money from the National Endowment for the Humanities in the United States. And we put on these workshops for elementary and middle school and high school teachers from across the United States, K through 12 teachers. And we were funded to do this 4 times, 2011, 2013, 2015, and also 2021, but because of COVID, we had to postpone. Well, after doing this a couple of times, these programs brought in teachers from all over the United States, about 80 of them each time we did it. And we also brought in scholars of the Underground Railroad to comment on the means by which people were arriving in New Bedford, to tell some of their actual stories, the people who we could document. And what emerged from this between 2011 and 2013 and 2015 was that an enormous number of these people arriving in New Bedford were arriving by water. They had escaped by water moving coastwise along the eastern seaboard of the United States. And we kept seeing this again and again and again. And other kinds of evidence started to emerge, things like runaway slave ads and references found in narratives of escapes that were published by people who had escaped from enslavement in the United States. And so as we did this project that was focused only on New Bedford, it became very clear that this was really a much broader, wider story that had a lot to say about the Underground Railroad generally. And it began to emerge really that a big part of the Underground Railroad story was not being told. It wasn't being represented accurately in the historical literature because the maritime side was being left out. And it became clear to us that this was really an important part of the story that we wanted folks to understand. Now, of course, part of this is beginning to emerge through other scholarship, like Jeffrey Bolster's wonderful book, Blackjacks, which comes out in 1998. And in that book, of course, he documents that the maritime workforce of the United States, of the merchant marine and military vessels too, was significantly African-American. About 18% of the entire workforce in the early part of the 19th century were Black sailors, and they played a very important role. Most of them were free Blacks. Some of them are people who are enslaved but are giving their wages to their owners. But the fact is that you have in circulation on the vessels that are going up and down the eastern seaboard in enormous numbers, carrying the great bulk of the trade of the United States by water and not over land, that a big part of that story involved mariners, sailors of color, doing that very essential work that gave them great geographic knowledge and great understanding of how the United States geography looked and important strategic knowledge of different areas of the coastal United States. Knowledge that people working inland wouldn't necessarily, and almost probably would never have developed if they didn't have the chance to travel like mariners did. Well, a key part of this story is looking at the workforce of the southern ports in the United States prior to the American Civil War. And it turns out that in almost all of the major ports and all of the waterfronts and all of the waterways of the far south, where slavery was legal, the workforce on the waterfront was almost entirely enslaved African-American people. They are doing all of the key work of the ports. They are persons who are developing extraordinary knowledge about shipping, about the maritime industries, and it's pretty much all in their hands. And that provides the sort of base, the foundation for the opportunities to escape that we are going to see as we develop this story. Now, what kind of work are they doing? They are waterfront, dock, and wharf workers. These are folks who are working on land to support the maritime industries that are so crucial to the U.S. economy. They are waterfront, dock, and wharf workers. They are longshoremen and stevedores who are loading and unloading ships. And by the way, that's pretty skilled labor, because for a sailing vessel to function properly, it's got to be properly loaded in a way that is balanced to make the best use of its sailing characteristics. And so loading and unloading a vessel was very important work that required a skilled eye and experience to do it properly, so that a vessel would be in good trim for its sailing. So there are also warehousemen that are managing the goods going on and off the vessels. They are drovers and teamsters that are bringing wagon loads and cart loads of goods, that provisioning the vessels, providing the kinds of tools and all of the necessary products, not only to send out as merchandise, but to keep the vessels working. You also have essential shipyard labor. So people who understand sail making, rigging, caulking to keep a vessel watertight. All of this work is being done by enslaved African Americans in the antebellum period in the South. There is some oversight by skilled white mariners or white shipyard workers, but for the most part, these are spaces that are intensely African American and have very little oversight, really, of people in the white owner class looking over them. Another important thing about this is that this kind of information, or this kind of experience working on the waterfront, gives people a clear overview of exactly how ports worked, the rhythms of the sea, the rhythms of enforcement or administration, the people who cleared vessels in and out of harbor for customs, any kind of enforcement authority. The workers knew exactly when and where they would arrive, and usually understood the circumstances under which any kind of overseer would be on site to sort of check their work or to check the ships going in and out of harbor. So this gives them an understanding of how the work of the port worked, and that then gave them chances to get in and out of the harbor as potential escapees. Not only are people working on land, but they're also working on the water. They're working in skilled waterborne labor as well. So you've got African American fishermen. They're working on ferry boats, largely autonomously, with no oversight at all. Lightermen who are working on boats called lighters, which is a kind of a large workboat that you use to load and unload vessels that are not on a dock or on a wharf. When they're on an anchorage or on a mooring out in the harbor, you have to load them and unload them using boats called lighters. And this is very, very tricky work. You have to be skilled as a waterman to do this. They're also working on large vessels as deckhands, and even skilled pilots who know the maritime hazards, the navigational hazards of going in and out of these very tricky harbors in the South, where there are frequently sandbars that form and then go away with each tide or storm. It's an important work, and it's often African Americans who are doing that work, and most of the time they are enslaved. To give you a sense of just how intensely the coasts of the United States were occupied by enslaved people. This is a map from just South Carolina, but it gives you a sense the darker areas are where the concentrations of the enslaved population are. And of course, they're always near the waterways, because the only way to get the very heavy agricultural goods produced by plantations, the only way to get them out to the harbors was down these very small streams and waterways that are tidal. And this work is all being done with small boats or bigger boats that are crewed by enslaved African Americans. And they're coming down to the bigger harbors, loading those goods onto larger seagoing vessels, and then taking them out of the harbor to go to the markets where they're going to be sold, often in the north. By the way, another important point here is that during the antebellum period, the United States and most of the world understood that legal jurisdiction in coastal waterways only extended out 3 miles from the shoreline. And so once someone was offshore in a vessel, once they were 3 miles offshore, they were largely out of the immediate reach of any kind of, and out of the jurisdiction of authorities that might be inclined to try to re-enslave them. So that 3 mile limit is an important part of this story as well. One of the contributors to the book, and whose work I would like to draw attention to, is a guy called David Siselsky. He provided, I think it was chapter 3 of our book. He wrote earlier a book called The Waterman's Song, Slavery and Freedom in Maritime North Carolina, in which he described a lot of this activity that I've been speaking about over the last few minutes, describing the populations of the working waterfronts of the South. And so it was just natural that he be included in this volume, and his contribution was very key to the creation of the foundational understanding of the knowledge of the ports in the South. Another way that we know a lot about this story is through newspaper advertisements, so-called runaway slave ads that were put in newspapers all along the coast and even the inland of the United States. There are roughly 220,000 of these extant from the mid-18th century, the 1750s and 60s, up until the time of the American Civil War in the 1860s or so. So again and again and again, as we looked at these newspaper advertisements, these runaway slave ads, we would see specific language relating to the sea. And these runaway slave advertisements are kind of formulaic. They almost always include some key components. You'll have the person who places the ad, which is usually the owner of a runaway enslaved person or their agents. They'll give a physical description. They'll say where they escaped from, but they'll almost always include some speculation about how the owner thinks the enslaved person had made their bid for freedom. And so I've highlighted this here. This is from 1772. It's about a young man named Phil. He's about 20 years old, 5'9", but he had experience with sailing and with working on vessels. As he has been used to the sea, he will probably endeavor to get on board some ship and make his escape out of the colony. All masters of vessels are therefore forewarned from harboring or carrying him off at their peril. And so we have an acknowledgement that this guy probably escaped by ship, and we have a warning to ship's captains, masters of vessels. So there's already not only the acknowledgement that people are escaping by water in the 1770s, but there is the beginning of a legal structure to punish people who are helping them to escape. Now, of course, this is before the U.S. Revolutionary War breaks out, but we're going to see this kind of thing develop right through the end of the 18th century. This is another one. This is from Philadelphia, 1796, when Philadelphia was serving as the capital of the United States. And this is from no less of a household than the President of the United States, absconded from the household of the President of the United States. So George Washington's agent put this advertisement in the American Daily Advertiser. Oni Judge, a light mulatto girl about 20 years old, and he suspected that she also had escaped by water. As she may attempt to escape by water, all masters of vessels and others are cautioned against receiving her on board. And in fact, she did. She escaped from Philadelphia down the Chesapeake Bay by water and then northward on the same vessel to New Hampshire. And try as he might, George Washington made several attempts to get her back, but was not able to do so. And she is interviewed in the 19th century about how she had managed to escape and live out the rest of her life in freedom. Here's another advertisement. This is from the mid-19th century, from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. A woman named Mary, age 26, and a description of her, and another person named William. Both of them have had for a long time relations with the Negro fishermen at the bayou. And so we are given to understand that there's a very good chance that they have escaped using their connections with African-American watermen who are completely used to the waters in which they operate and are masters at operating the vessels that they worked on. Now, there's another kind of public notice. And by the way, going back to these, there are tens of thousands of slave advertisements that mention, and many of them mention escape by water. We can't say exactly how many, because all of these are not searchable and they haven't been gathered into a single database. But there are efforts at work right now trying to do exactly that. We know roughly how many there are, and in our sampling, we've found pretty high percentages on the order of 25% and more that are mentioning escape by water, but we don't have any means to give an accurate number of what percentage of these advertisements mention waterborne escape. This is a different kind of advertisement. It's not placed by someone who is an owner trying to recoup their runaway property. This is a shipmaster. And this is an advertisement placed in the New Bedford newspaper towards the end of the 19th century. William Tabor, which is a very well-known name in this region. And what he's doing is responding to the requirements of the first Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, passed shortly after the ratification of the Constitution. And what he's trying to do is cover himself from and safeguard himself from legal prosecution because he's been part of an escape attempt. So I want to read through this. It's important to kind of read between the lines to try to understand what the master of the vessel, the captain, William Tabor, is actually trying to achieve with this and what he maybe knew or didn't know when he put this public notice in the newspaper. So he says, to all whom it may concern, know ye that I, William Tabor, commander of the sloop Union, sailed from York River in Virginia on or about the 28th of March last, bound to this port, New Bedford. That on the day after sailing, I discovered a Negro on board said sloop who had concealed himself unbeknownst to me. So he's saying, I had nothing to do with this. This was done without my knowledge or my consent. This guy just showed up on my vessel and we sailed with him on board, but we didn't know that. He's a stowaway. So we're not responsible. But here's where it gets really interesting. It appearing inconsistent for me to return, the wind being ahead, I proceeded on my voyage and landed him in this port, New Bedford. So what he's saying is the weather did not allow him to turn the vessel around to take the rightful property back to his rightful owner. What he's saying is the weather conditions did not permit him to return. He had to continue on his voyage because he's already out in the Gulf Stream. The wind is from the south and blowing him north. And it would have been too impossible for him to take the property, the legal property, the human being back. He calls it, so I continue. He calls his name James. Is that really his name? We have really no way of knowing. He's about 27 years old and says he belongs to Mr. Shackelford, a planter in Kings and Queens County, Virginia. Now, that might very well have been true, But Shackelford is in Virginia, and this paper is being published in in New Bedford, Massachusetts. So eventually, Mr. Shackelford probably would hear about this because newspapers circulated up and down the East Coast, but it would be a very long time before he got this information. Nevertheless, the legalese of this public notice continues. Any person claiming him will know by this information where he is, for which purpose it is made public in this manner, and every legal method has been taken to prevent the owner losing the property in my power, William Tabor, New Bedford, April 20th, 1797. This was a weekly publication. The ad would typically run over 3 successive publications. But by the time the owner is alerted to the fact and to the whereabouts of his enslaved property, the person who calls himself James could be anywhere and likely was in Canada or northern New York or somewhere where they would be out of harm's way. So the purpose of this advertisement and this public notice is to give legal coverage to the captain and to the crew who were liable for prosecution or for having the vessel taken, or to paying a very large fine so that if they ever showed their face in the port where they sailed from, they could be prosecuted for having assisted an escape. But this public notice gives them legal coverage, so that may not happen. There are some other advertisements. This is another one from New Bedford, and I wanted to draw your attention to it just because this is an advert from a southern port where a person who has run away, his name is Harry. Harry is supposed to be carried off by a certain Thomas Weiner of Westport, Massachusetts. That's just a few miles from where I am now in New Bedford. He's a mulatto, sorry, the captain, Thomas Weiner, is a mulatto who traded here and cleared out as captain of a small vessel from Westport, came to the port of Snow Hill, Maryland, where he got a load of corn and staves and cleared for Norfolk, Virginia, whence he said he intended for Westport, whither I suppose him to have gone. The point of this advertisement is that Weiner was connected to Paul Cuffey, a Afro-Indian captain, one of the wealthiest men of color in the United States at the time. They were widely suspected of having assisted intentionally and deliberately the escape of enslaved people from the South. This advertisement is further evidence that people in the South were becoming increasingly concerned that this kind of activity was going on. And Westport was known to have been a place where there were a large abolitionist community, many of whom were members of the Society of Friends. They're Quakers, who are the main economic drivers behind the whaling industry as well. So we have loads of these kinds of advertisements that give us information about the escape of enslaved people. Another way that we have information about this is through narratives that are published before and after the U.S. Civil War. This particular one is the story of Thomas H. Jones, his experience, which is published in Boston in 1862, but it recounts the story of his escape in 1849 in New York Harbor. Now, he had sailed, he had worked for a very long time as a longshoreman on the waterfronts of Wilmington, North Carolina. He got aboard a brig called the Belle, which was sailing north in 1849. But he was worried that he was going to be re-enslaved by the captain of the Belle. And so when they came into New York Harbor, device, some kind of raft, and he jumps overboard and he starts to paddle towards the shoreline in New York City. And he is providentially met, and this doesn't seem to have been planned, it really seems to have been chance. 2 guys in a small boat who happened to be abolitionists or have abolitionist sentiment helped him to get away. They recognized that he was a fugitive, and they got him into New York, and eventually he finds his way to New Bedford, Massachusetts, and then up to Boston, and manages to live the rest of his life in freedom. And he publishes a book about it then as the Civil War is getting underway. There are lots of these publications, and about 70% of them, of the known published works that are escape narratives, about 70% of them mention escape by water as a means by which people escaped from enslavement. This is the story of Elizabeth Blakely. She was about 15 when she escaped from Wilmington, North Carolina to Boston. Her trip took quite a long time, about 2 weeks, and she suffered pretty brutally on board. It was a winter voyage. She was got frostbite, but she did survive, and her story was published in the 1920s when she was quite of an advanced age. But we know about this because of the publication. Abolitionists who worked in the Underground Railroad also published accounts. In 1880, Austin Bierce published Reminiscences of Fugitive Slave Days in Boston, and he recounted that he maintained a small yacht called the Moby Dick, and in the early 1850s, right after the novel Moby Dick came out, they would go out to boats, to large ships that arrived in Boston Harbor from southern ports, and discreetly inquire if there were any contraband fugitive slaves on board. And if there were, they would secretly at night take them off the vessel and then bring them and land them in Boston and get them into a safe house and then move them further north where they could be safeguarded from re-enslavement. Of course, this is immediately after the passage of the Second Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, and that creates a much more dire circumstance for people who are enslaved legally, but living in freedom in the North, because they can then, the chances of them being re-enslaved and taken back south go up after 1850. Another book that gives us a lot of information about maritime escapes, of course, is William Still's famous book about the Underground Railroad. Many of the illustrations in the book depict maritime escapes and maritime activity of the Underground Railroad. We have this illustration of Captain Fontaine and the schooner City of Richmond, which is about to be searched by a delegation of officials in Norfolk, Virginia. This episode happened in the circumstances where there actually were people secreted on board the vessel, and despite a pretty thorough search, none of them were found, and they made their way safely northward. Fontaine was a schooner captain who ran what was called a packet vessel that had a regular route up and down the East Coast. He stopped at multiple ports regularly on a kind of regular circuit, carrying cargo and mail and other kinds of things. And though he was suspected, he was actually running, part of his operation was to sort of systematically remove enslaved people from the South and bring them north. And many of them then were fed into the Underground Railroad safe house system through William Still's establishment in the city of Philadelphia. So Still recorded that, and that of other people. This is another illustration from his book, and I really like this illustration a lot because it sort of encapsulates many of the important themes of the Underground Railroad maritime side that are discussed in the book. What are some of those themes? Well, you have people being offloaded secretly in an obscure place at night from a large coastal vessel. In this case, it looks like it's a schooner. It is the middle of the night. There are operatives of the Underground Railroad who are people of color helping to get them off the vessel. We have women and children, and it was much, much easier to carry family groups, women, children, if you could take them on a vessel where they had relatively little to do except enjoy the ride up the coast. They're not constantly trying to evade discovery on land. They're not evading patrols and dogs. They're not daily searching for food or for a place to stay where they will be out of sight. Once you're aboard a ship, it's a much more safe and much more efficient means of traveling great distances in a relatively short period of time. And so this makes it easier for families, entire family groups, or larger numbers of people to escape by water. And we have several instances of that happening. I have a couple other things to say about this picture, but I'll note one point on the subject of evidence. Remember, it's important to keep in mind that this activity was entirely clandestine and it was illegal. And so it's very hard sometimes to find evidence of these kinds of things happening, except through retrospective publications like accounts. We often hear about attempted escapes when they fail. We often don't hear about them if they are successful, because people were trying to keep them secret so that they could escape. Two other points about this. We have carriages waiting to take the fugitive population here on board. And those carriages have veiled windows, covered windows, so that people couldn't see inside. And so this is very consistent with what we know about Underground Railroad escapes, people being secreted away in covered carriages or carriages with covered windows, a population of people of color and white Americans who are working together on the Underground Railroad in places like Philadelphia. This is all very, very consistent with what we know and what's revealed in William Still's book about the Underground Railroad. Well, I want to turn my attention now as the talk is winding down. I want to talk a little bit about New Bedford, because New Bedford becomes a place that is a real destination. It was known as the Fugitives' Gibraltar because it was a safe place for people who had escaped enslavement to come and to work. And it was not only a place that was safe, it was a place where escaped enslaved people or formerly enslaved people could make a living, because there was work for them in this whaling boomtown in Massachusetts. So here's a contemporary illustration of New Bedford's harbor and port town along the Acushnet River here in Massachusetts. It's taken from another town across, not taken, but drawn from another town across the river at the mouth of the harbor at another town called Fairhaven. And of course, the town is known as the Fugitives' Gibraltar. It was a descriptive name that New Bedford was known as from at least the 1840s, if not earlier. And a number of factors come together to make New Bedford this important location for people trying to escape from enslavement. One is that the whaling business, which ran close to 400 vessels a year out of New Bedford, was almost entirely in the hands of Quaker abolitionists. So the Quakers who began the whaling business in Nantucket and then moved it to New Bedford in the very earliest part of the 19th century, even though Quakers had been slave owners into the 18th century, by the end of the 18th century, they had divested themselves of most of their interests in enslavement, and anyone who was a Quaker who continued to be involved in slavery and the slave trade was pretty much ostracized from the Quaker organizations. But this area of New England was a major concentration of the Society of Friends, and New Bedford was deeply influenced by Quaker teaching and Quaker presence, and their economic activities too, running the whaling industry. So they are, by the late 18th, early 19th century, profoundly abolitionist in their sentiment, and they began to draw a large African-American population as whaling expanded in this important protected deep water harbor that is New Bedford. By the way, New Bedford, even today, is still the #1 working port in the United States in terms of the value of the fishing catch. New Bedford's #1. It's been #1 for more than 20 years. And it still is that way. And we still have a lot of the infrastructure of the working waterfront that's here. It's just they're not catching whales anymore. They're catching ground fish like scallops. But this is important to understand because it's still an active working port, because it's a protected deep water harbor. Whenever there's a hurricane that threatens this area, the ships from all over come to New Bedford to ride out the storm. And that happens again and again. It gives me insight into what the place must have looked like 150 years ago or more. The scholar who really drew a lot of this work together is my colleague, Catherine Grover, who contributed one of the chapters to the Sailing to Freedom book. She wrote in, I think it's 2001, The Fugitives, Gibraltar, Escaping Slaves, and Abolitionism in New Bedford, Massachusetts, in which she was able to document the large numbers of people of African descent who had come to live in New Bedford. Some of them well-known, others completely anonymous. But as I said, New Bedford had a very large population in proportion to the overall population that were people of African descent. The New Bedford Historical Society that I mentioned before is headquartered in this house, the white one on the left, which is the Nathan and Polly Johnson home. They were Quakers, they were abolitionists, they were people of color, and they gave the first refuge to Frederick and Anna Douglass when they arrived from the South in New Bedford in 1838. And then, of course, right next to it is this yellow home, which was a Quaker meeting house built in the 18th century. The new Quaker meeting house, which is still in use, is diagonal across the street. You can't see it in the photo, but it was built of brick in 1822. And that's the one that would have been standing when Frederick and Anna Douglass showed up in having made their bid for freedom in 1838. So this is a bit of the photograph is not precisely to the time, it's a bit later, but you get a sense of the working waterfront and how it might have looked about the time Douglass showed up. Douglass was trained in Maryland in some waterfront skills. He knew how to caulk the hull of a wooden vessel. He was a caulker. Although he couldn't find work as a caulker in New Bedford, the white caulkers would not wanted to work, did not want to work with an African American. But 10 years after Douglass had arrived, by the 1840s, that had changed, and there were mixed race crews of caulkers working on the New Bedford waterfront, and we have photographs of them. But many of these buildings still exist. Some of the church towers are still in use, and the waterfront in some ways hasn't changed a whole lot. Douglass used a ruse, a maritime ruse, to help him in his escape attempt. He had a seaman's protection certificate, which showed that a mariner, even if they were a mariner of color, it certified that they were a free person of color who was working in legitimate maritime business. Now, Douglass carried one of these papers. It wasn't his. He had borrowed it from an associate of his who was a free black mariner. He never had to show it, though, because he dressed the way that a mariner might have dressed, using sailor's clothing. And consequently, according to his own account, he was never asked to prove that he was a sailor. And that speaks to just how common it was for African-American sailors, free men of color, to be moving up and down the East Coast of the United States in the 1830s from areas where slavery was legal to areas where slavery was not. Just a couple of other images about New Bedford and its connection to whaling. So a typical whaling voyage would last from anywhere from 8 or 9 months to 3 or 4 years. Some of them lasted even longer. So if you were a person of color escaping slavery, and you're a man and you have some maritime skills and you wanted to avoid recapture and re-enslavement, New Bedford offered the perfect way to do that. We have evidence of men freshly having escaped from the far south, signing aboard whaling crews and being gone for, to the Pacific Ocean, to the Indian Ocean for years at a time, and thus avoiding recapture and earning some money in the process. New Bedford offered many of the same kinds of opportunities for work that many of the fugitives were leaving from the South. And so they could put those skills to work immediately upon arriving in New Bedford and Fairhaven, where there was always a need for labor aboard these whaling ships. The average crew size was about 25. They were constantly looking for men. You can even look at some of the sea shanties from the time. There's a very famous one that I won't sing it for you, but the lyrics go like this. It's advertised in Boston, New York, and Buffalo, 500 brave Americans a whaling for to go. So they're always looking for labor to be on these ships, and fugitives filled in some of those labor needs. Well, this has been a pretty rapid overview of the basic argument of the book. We finished the book. The book is constructed and organized in such a way that the chapters move geographically from the southern ports towards the north. And so if you read through the 10 chapters of the book, we begin in South Carolina and we finish in New Bedford and Boston. And then there's a final capstone chapter that talks about new research opportunities with digitized runaway slave advertisements. So that became then the final chapter of the book. And I think I will just mention a few other people who were involved and who we know are documented people who had escaped by water. One of them is Lewis Temple, who was a blacksmith in New Bedford in the 1840s. He had escaped by water from South Carolina, possibly North Carolina. His statue is now on the grounds of the New Bedford Free Public Library, which, by the way, has one of the largest collections of whaling logbooks. And he is notable for a variety of reasons, but as a blacksmith, he created a harpoon called the toggle head harpoon that revolutionized the whaling industry. It was a much more efficient way to catch whales, and an African-American mariner invented that particular piece of equipment that everyone at the time recognized was a huge improvement over the old sort of arrowhead-shaped harpoon. And if we look at the art of the whaling industry, people of color are very much front and center, sort of hiding in plain sight if you want to look at them. Look for them. The New Bedford Whaling Museum has changed remarkably over the last generation or so, and really started to tell the story of people of color in the whaling trades. And that's due in large part to the efforts of the New Bedford Historical Society saying, look, there are stories of people of color here that we need to talk about, and you need to change this presentation of the whaling business from one of being only Yankee boys, white whalers going out heroically to catch whales. We need to talk about everyone else who was involved, including large numbers of Cape Verdeans and African Americans escaping from the far south. So they turn up in the art of the whaling business, and we see them again and again. I'm sorry, this is not a very good image. But by the end of the 19th century, post-Civil War, African Americans are the majority of the crews on the whaling boats. And that's just sort of moving as the whaling industry changed. This is the New Bedford Whaling Museum. The exhibition, Sailing to Freedom, Sailing to Freedom, Maritime Dimensions of the Underground Railroad is currently up. We are working on an online version that you'll be able to see from wherever you are in the world. And that should be available sometime in the next month or so. We hope to have it up by Christmas. But I think that is now all I have to say. thank you very much for your attention, and I really look forward to your questions and hearing what you have to say and your observations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Walker. Thank you for a very enlightening presentation, for highlighting the voices of the enslaved that were silenced in previous historical reports. Please, if anyone here has a question, please raise your hand, whether virtually or physically, if your cameras are on, and I will call you for the questions or comments for Professor Walker. Graham?
Hi, great presentation. I just wondered, my area of interest is Nova Scotia, and we see self-emancipated Blacks arriving into communities with very little backstory. On our end, do you see on the departure side of things, people heading off, continuing on to like New Brunswick and Nova Scotia?
Right, that's a great question, and I wanted to include a chapter in the book, and I was looking for scholars who knew about the stories of the communities there in Nova Scotia, and there are some really wonderful stories. But one of the scholars I talked to was reticent to join our project, in part because he didn't see it as being part of this Underground Railroad story. He saw it as the main populations of people of color who came during time of war, having assisted the British military establishment during the War of 1812 and the Revolutionary War before that. So I thought that it would be a kind of nice capstone chapter to include the story of those communities in Nova Scotia. But then more to your question, did we see a lot of evidence of the folks who came independent of those periods? Did they move on to Nova Scotia? Some certainly did. Some sailed through Nova Scotia on their way to the United Kingdom. But I don't think there were any very large numbers that augmented the communities that came under the circumstances that we've just talked about. I don't have a lot of examples. There were some, but most of the people that we tracked them as far as where they found their sort of doorway to freedom in northern ports. Those who remained in New Bedford and Boston and in Nantucket, we knew a bit more about them, but we weren't able to follow up so much on the Canadian Maritime provinces. And that's a bit of a shame. I would have liked to have seen something like that reflected in the book. We are thinking about another volume to focus on the Great Lakes and passages into Canada. So I didn't mention that geographically, I was born in Detroit and I was raised in Ohio, right where a lot of those major Underground Railroad routes were going over land. I would like to see more scholarship done on the Maritime provinces, the coast of Maine, and the Great Lakes, because I think that's an important part of the story that also is underrepresented in the current Underground Railroad scholarship.
Okay, I've followed up with an email.
Yeah.
And we can discuss it further, because it'd be interesting to continue and compare notes.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Please do get in touch with me. So you can find me in the Department of History at UMass Dartmouth. So very easy.
Right. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Any other questions or comments, please?
I see Yvonne Brown seems to have a question.
Yeah, thank you for that presentation. It adds to how much we are beginning to understand about Black people's agency during this very difficult period in our history. and the escape through the water routes. I mean, you mentioned the Great Lakes, but it took, as you know, the escape by water took many, many bodies of water. Jesus, I forgot what I was going to say. The West Coast of Canada is in the same way that our Nova Scotia's colleague mentioned what happened on that coast.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to look at what happened on the West Coast. So I know of one group that came up in 1858 from California and formed a significant community on Vancouver's Island. But I think there's more to the story we've gotten than there is. And research such as you have been doing would reveal a lot of unknowns up to this point. And thank you for your, the other thing is that a lot of, it wasn't only bodies that came through these escape routes. There was a lot of information that was transported.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the work of Marcus Garvey, for example, and his newspaper, The Black World.
Yes.
That was disseminated by seamen all the way to South Africa.
Yeah.
And started a whole different layer to the freedom struggles. So I'm very excited about the kind of research that's happening now and by ourselves, and I just find it quite an exciting time. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for those words and those insights. I want to address two things that you brought up, and I think they're really very important points, one of which I should have been more forceful with in the process of my presentation, and that's the subject of agency. The whole book is framed around, and I think all of the contributors were united on this idea that we really wanted to place a very heavy focus on the idea that most of the escapes by water from the South happen with very little assistance from anyone in what might be considered a traditional underground railroad capacity. There simply weren't a lot of operatives in the ports of the South. And so what that means is, and yes, there are some cases where people are assisted, but when they're assisted, they're usually receiving assistance on an ad hoc basis, often from people they don't know, but even more frequently, they're using their own skills, their own knowledge, their own experience. The agency for these escapes falls squarely on the shoulders of the people making the escapes. And so it's not the story of fugitives who are being passed along and assisted by operatives of the Underground Railroad. Instead, it's the story of people on their own initiative, with their own strategic knowledge, finding ways to make their way into freedom. And I find these very powerful stories. One of the stories which I think is actually being developed into a film, and it deserves a film because it's such a remarkable story, is the story of Robert Smalls, who was a working pilot in the port of Charleston, South Carolina. And when the Civil War begins, he steals a gunboat, a Confederate gunboat, which he has been crewing on. And he takes a number of family members and the crew with him. I think it's a total of almost 20 people who escape. They sail it because he knows the codes and he knows the signals. They sail it out under the nose of a Confederate fortress, out to the blockading Union ships. And they basically turn it over to the Union Navy during the very early days of the Civil War. This guy, Robert Smalls, for those of you who don't know the story, there are some spoiler alerts here, but I'll tell you very quickly, but it's so remarkable. He ends up serving throughout the war, becomes a prosperous person in the North, ends up buying the home of the person who had enslaved him, and is one of the first African-American representatives to the US Congress during the Reconstruction period following the Civil War. So he's a fascinating guy. And this story is recounted in the book. It's fairly well known, but there are some other ones that are rather similar to that story from other ports in the South, and those are also in the book. And I invite you to look them up. But this subject of agency is so important, and we really tried to put the focus on people of color who are making their own decisions about escaping. The other point that you said had to do with the geography of the Underground Railroad. And this is a kind of a matter of debate. People debate about the terminal dates of the Underground Railroad and where it operated. For me, I think that we were talking about people finding their way to freedom through a variety of means. And one of the great understudied areas, now that our book is out, that we kind of want to turn our attention to is the Gulf Coast, people escaping southward to the Caribbean and to Mexico, where slavery had been outlawed in the 1830s. And so you have a lot of people escaping not northward to Canada, but southward to European colonies where, or newly independent countries where slavery is illegal. And with the moving of information, the Haitian Revolution in the 1790s to 1804, the slaveholding societies around Haiti in the Caribbean and in the continental US were absolutely terrified that news of this successful African-led republic that actually embraced the values of the French Revolution and the American Revolution and applied them to people of color. They were terrified, the owner class was terrified that this knowledge was going to become widespread in their enslaved communities and inspire them to do something akin to what had been done in Haiti. And of course, news did spread because African-American mariners would tell this story, and it was so important. So I feel like you put your finger on a couple of themes that we try to draw out a little bit in the book, and I can't do it justice here in an hour-long talk, but there is a lot of that information in the pages of the volume.
Good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions, please, or comments? Any other questions or comments?
In my experience, you might as well let him come on camera because
Yes, that's right.
And we'd all love to see him or her.
Right. And introduce him.
Actually, in my case, it's both him and her. I have 4-year-old twins.
Oh man, okay, great. But I'm not bothered in the least if they want to make an appearance.
Any other comments or questions, please? Any comments or questions for Professor Walker?
Well, I'm really very grateful for the opportunity and thank you. I've given you how to reach me. I can give it to you quickly. I'll put it in the chat, actually. I'll put my email address, but I'm very easy to find. Hold on one second.
And he's very quick with his emails too.
Not always, but most of the time.
Yeah, mostly quick with his emails.
All right, there we go. So yeah, if you'd like to reach out with an email, I will do my best to respond. And if you have any follow-up questions, I'll do my best to talk with you. We can even do a Zoom meeting if you like.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Walker. Thank you, everyone who came for our Tubman talk today. Hopefully we see all of you next week for yet another one. And just for those who haven't heard, the Harriet Tubman Institute of York University is considering releasing or is working on releasing a peer-reviewed journal. So please keep us in mind for when you have publications and you're looking for a journal to send it to. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a, thank you, Rebecca. So please join us again next week for our Tubman talk with Dr. Achua at 2:30 p.m. Now we'll go back to the usual time next week, 2:30 p.m.
Very good.
Thank you, everyone, again, and see you next week.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you, Dr. Walker.
Oh, there they are. Hi. Just very quickly, before everyone signs off, the Harriet Tubman National Park site in Maryland is thinking of being one of the locations where the part of the exhibition might travel to. And so, hi guys. And so if they do, I'll let you know. But the Harriet Tubman connection there is also very strong. So, all right, have a great afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You too. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Which way I make it go?